On a barrier island shaped by storms, fortunes, and grand ambition, one estate has witnessed more reversals of wealth than any other in American high society. Mar-a-Lago was built as a palace of permanence, a monument designed to outlive markets, marriages, and even the woman who imagined it. But behind its opulence lies a lesser-known story, a story not of the heiress who built it, but of another heiress whose life slowly unraveled within its shadow. This is the story of an inheritance that was supposed to last forever, a fortune that vanished piece by piece, and a woman who became one of Mar-a-Lago's most unexpected casualties. To understand how an heiress could lose everything at a place built to symbolize endless wealth, one must begin with the mythology surrounding Palm Beach itself. For nearly a century, Palm Beach functioned as America's winter stage for the rich. The hotels, the clubs, the avenues, and eventually the private estates created an ecosystem where success was measured not by financial stability, but by visibility, participation, and social performance. The island rewarded displays of prosperity and punished even the slightest indication of decline. Mar-a-Lago magnified this effect. Built by Marjorie Merriweather Post as a winter court for American aristocracy, the estate demanded spectacle. Its 126 rooms, gold leaf ceilings, imported stone, and European treasures required an army of workers simply to maintain the illusion of ease. The house did not just display wealth, it consumed it. For those who could afford to live and entertain at that scale, it became a symbol of status. But for anyone whose resources began to shrink, Mar-a-Lago became something far more dangerous, a measuring stick that revealed financial reality with uncompromising clarity. The heiress at the center of this story did not build Mar-a-Lago, but she inherited something equally formidable, a fortune large enough to assume it would last forever. She grew up in a world shaped by the Post legacy, where philanthropy, luxury, and refinement blended seamlessly into a lifestyle that appeared effortless from the outside. Her childhood was filled with the symbols of inherited privilege. Summers in the Adirondacks, winters in Florida, tutors fluent in multiple languages, and a social education based less on academics and more on the expectation that she would someday step into the public roles her mother once filled. But inheritances rarely come with instruction manuals. Wealth accumulated over decades can disappear in half the time, especially when its steward believes the supply to be bottomless. The heiress entered adulthood with advantages few could imagine. Yet she also inherited the weight of expectation, maintain the lifestyle, preserve the estates, honor the family reputation, and remain visible in circles where visibility meant survival. Mar-a-Lago served as the stage where these expectations collided with reality. By the mid-20th century, maintaining the estate required more than nostalgia and tradition. Utilities, staff wages, repairs, and taxes outpaced the trust funds meant to support it. Even for a wealthy family, the numbers strained belief. It cost more to keep the lights on at Mar-a-Lago for a single season than most families earned in a decade. The heiress understood this. But she also understood the unspoken rule of Palm Beach. Appearances must be maintained, regardless of private difficulty. Decline could not be visible. The facade mattered. And Mar-a-Lago, with its sweeping corridors and soaring ceilings, demanded a kind of theatrical prosperity that was no longer sustainable. Every dinner party, every charity gala, every season she returned to Florida required resources that were dwindling faster than she realized. The financial pressure grew quietly at first. Staff were reduced, but only slightly, to avoid notice. Repairs were postponed in areas guests rarely saw. Wing after wing was closed during off-season months to conserve electricity. Yet, despite these efforts, the numbers did not improve. The estate behaved like a living organism with an appetite that grew more aggressive with time. Outside Mar-a-Lago, the world changed. Tax laws shifted. The cost of maintaining historic properties skyrocketed. The economy moved through cycles that were unforgiving to individuals reliant on inherited wealth. But for the heiress, the most difficult changes came from within her own life. Divorces divided assets. Investment missteps reduced what earlier generations had built. Trust funds that once seemed inexhaustible became visibly finite. The illusion of stability held longer than expected, but eventually Palm Beach noticed. Quiet conversations circulated through club dining rooms. Some speculated that the family might sell the estate. Others whispered about deferred taxes or unpaid contractors. In a community where financial standing functioned as currency, even the slightest rumor could erode credibility. The heiress felt the shift. Invitations grew fewer. Social obligations became more demanding as she tried to maintain the visibility required to preserve her standing. Her life became a cycle of hosting, managing, and quietly struggling to hold together the reality that Mar-a-Lago projected onto her. The final unraveling began not with a dramatic event, but with a series of subtle, incremental decisions, each financially reasonable, each socially catastrophic. Liquidating jewelry, selling land, releasing longtime staff, renting portions of the estate for private functions that would once have been considered unthinkably gauche. Each act chipped away at the illusion that everything was fine. By the time the estate was officially placed on the market, the heiress had already lost more than wealth. She had lost the identity that Palm Beach society had constructed for her. Selling Mar-a-Lago, even in theory, signaled to the social world that her lineage no longer guaranteed stability. When buyers walked away, citing the impossible cost of maintenance, the humiliation intensified. Her financial troubles were now public knowledge. The heiress who once walked through Mar-a-Lago's corridors as though they were an extension of her own inheritance now found herself overshadowed by the very house she was trying to survive. What began as a symbol of her family's legacy became evidence of its decline. When demolition became a real possibility, the heiress faced the unthinkable. The palace built to immortalize a family's name might disappear under her watch, newspapers speculated. Preservationists protested. Developers circled. And in the midst of it, she confronted a truth that few heirs ever acknowledge. Inheritance is not the same as security. Inheriting wealth is not the same as knowing how to keep it. Just as the wrecking crews prepared to end the story, a new figure entered it, a buyer whose vision for Mar-a-Lago was radically different, and whose arrival would become both a last-minute salvation and the final confirmation that the heiress had lost everything. The deal that followed was not a triumph. It was a surrender. The estate she had been raised to protect slipped out of her control. The fortune that once seemed endless dissolved into taxes, legal fees, settlement costs, and obligations she could no longer meet. And when the papers were signed, the heiress who had grown up surrounded by unimaginable luxury became a symbol of something far more common, the fragility of inherited wealth. This was not simply the story of losing a house, it was the story of losing a world. The transfer of Mar-a-Lago marked the moment the heiress crossed an invisible threshold. Palm Beach society had long memories and short patience. Once the sale was finalized, her social standing shifted from lineage-based prestige to something more ambiguous. She was no longer the guardian of a landmark, but a reminder that even the most powerful fortunes could erode. The circles she once moved through with ease now regarded her with polite distance. The donors, the socialites, the long-established families who had attended her mother's galas viewed her loss not with sympathy, but with caution. It signaled vulnerability, something Palm Beach rarely forgave. The estate's transition to new ownership deepened this divide. Every renovation, every updated room, every modern addition signaled a new era, one that no longer required the heiress. The grand tower where she once stood overlooking the Atlantic now framed photographs for magazines and travel spreads featuring gatherings she was no longer invited to. The courtyard where she had once watched diplomats arrive became the backdrop of a different kind of spectacle. The ballroom, that had echoed with the voices of her mother's guests, now reflected chandeliers chosen by someone else, representing a version of luxury she did not recognize. For the heiress, these transformations were not just architectural, they were personal. Each change reinforced the realization that Mar-a-Lago had outgrown her, that the house she assumed would remain tethered to her identity had found new purpose without her. The separation felt harsher than any financial statement or legal document could express. The physical structure that defined her childhood, her adolescence, her early adulthood, now stood as a monument to her absence. In the months that followed the sale, evidence of her financial collapse surfaced quietly. Auctions dispersed items from secondary estates. Jewelry once worn at charity balls appeared in private catalogs. The artworks that lined hallways in homes from New York to Florida found new buyers. Each transaction was discreet, but in communities that monitored wealth as carefully as stock markets, nothing remained secret for long. The heiress who once held one of America's most significant private fortunes now navigated a life where every expenditure required calculation. Without Mar-a-Lago anchoring her winters, her seasonal rhythm changed. Invitations were fewer, phone calls slowed, social obligations dwindled. Her presence at charity events became occasional rather than expected. Some acquaintances approached her with a tone of gentle pity. Others simply avoided acknowledging the shift altogether. In Palm Beach, where identity was inseparable from lifestyle, her decline became both visible and inevitable. Yet, even amid financial contraction, she attempted to maintain the dignity of her lineage. She hosted intimate dinners instead of large gatherings. She donated what she could to charities she cared about. She continued attending the Red Cross ball, though now as a guest, rather than the hostess who had once defined its tone. She adapted, but adaptation came with emotional cost. The reminders were everywhere on Worth Avenue, in club dining rooms, in winter newsletters, detailing events now held at Mar-a-Lago under new leadership. Her loss extended beyond finances and social standing. It touched something more fragile: narrative. In elite families, stories of lineage often define purpose. Mar-a-Lago was not just a property, it was the story she inherited, the legacy she believed she would steward. Once that story slipped away, she faced the question that many heirs never expect to confront. Who are you without the inheritance that shaped your world? Her decline did not come from extravagance alone. It came from accumulated pressures, trust structures that favored preservation over accessibility, advisors who miscalculated, markets that shifted, legal fees that multiplied, and the sheer impossibility of maintaining pre-depression scale estates in a late 20th century economy. She inherited a world designed for another era, and no modern fortune could sustain it unchanged. As the years passed, the public narrative of Mar-a-Lago focused increasingly on its new owner, his restorations, his controversies, his transformations, his use of the estate as a stage for his own ambitions. The heiress watched this from afar, her connection reduced to historical footnotes. Articles describing the house referred to her family in past tense, as if the era of post-influence had ended the moment the ink dried on the sale contract. There were attempts to reclaim or reinterpret her identity. She became involved with cultural institutions, sat on boards, lent her name to discreet philanthropic initiatives. These efforts were respected, but they lacked the gravitational pull Mar-a-Lago once gave her. Without the estate, she operated in a quieter orbit, significant but no longer central. In private, she grieved the loss in ways the public never saw. She revisited old photographs, her mother standing in the courtyard during the first season, diplomats crowding into the living room for receptions, circus performers assembling on the lawn during charity events. Images of a world that no longer existed. Her grief was not simply for the house, but for the life trajectory it represented, the continuity it promised, the stability it symbolized. The emotional collapse mirrored the financial one. Without the structure of inherited wealth, she confronted vulnerabilities her upbringing had never prepared her for. Expenses that had once been absorbed effortlessly now required choices. Tradition collided with reality. The heiress who once moved through ballrooms with confidence now stood in lines at banks, signing documents that quantified the shrinking boundaries of her life. Those who knew her closely described this period not as a fall from grace, but as an unlearning. She began to understand wealth not as a birthright, but as a resource subject to erosion. She learned to navigate situations that earlier generations in her family never confronted. She learned humility in a world that prized visibility. She learned to let go of spaces she once believed were permanent extensions of herself. Her relationship with Mar-a-Lago evolved into something almost ghostly. She avoided passing it when she could. The sight of the tower, the sound of waves hitting the seawall, the glow of lights during evening events all triggered memories that sharpened the pain of loss. Yet on rare occasions, she found herself drawn back, not to visit, but simply to observe from a distance. There she would stand in the shadow of the estate, watching strangers enjoy spaces where she once played as a child, entertained as a young woman, and struggled as an heiress. One evening, long after the sale, she attended an event in Palm Beach that happened to be hosted at the club. The invitation had been extended through a mutual acquaintance, and declining would have signaled defeat. She entered cautiously, expecting discomfort. What she experienced was something deeper. Rooms she had known intimately now carried a different cadence. Conversations that once pivoted around her family name now drifted toward politics, investments, and social dynamics utterly detached from her past. A server passed by carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres, and for a moment she recognized the movement, the precise training her mother insisted upon decades earlier. But everything else had changed. The air smelled of new florals, the chandeliers cast different reflections, and the walls held none of the energy she remembered. It was Mar-a-Lago, but not hers. Not anymore. Standing in the ballroom, surrounded by mirrors and gold, she realized that the estate had simply moved on. It absorbed new identities, new ambitions, new symbols of power. Mar-a-Lago no longer needed her story to validate its existence. And in that realization came the quiet acknowledgement that she no longer needed it either. The heiress had lost everything financially, socially, and narratively. Yet, in losing the inheritance that once defined her, she discovered the one thing she had never been granted in her youth: the chance to define herself independent of legacy. In the years that followed her departure from Mar-a-Lago, the heiress learned to navigate a life that no longer revolved around the expectations of Palm Beach society. What had once been a rigid sequence of luncheons, galas, winter openings, and charity committees slowly gave way to routines shaped not by wealth but by practicality. She relocated to a smaller home, a residence chosen for comfort rather than prestige. For the first time, she lived without large staff, without multiple wings to heat or cool, without the built-in spectacle of grandeur that had once followed her everywhere she went. Yet even in this scaled-down life, traces of her upbringing remained. She maintained impeccable manners, dressed with old-world elegance, and spoke with the careful cadence of someone raised to perform refinement. But now these habits expressed themselves in quieter ways, in the way she set her table for one, in the postcards she sent to friends, in the small donations she continued to make to organizations she believed in. The absence of extravagance did not diminish her dignity. In some ways, it amplified it. She lived with a kind of grace that few understood, shaped not by the possession of wealth, but by the loss of it. Her emotional landscape shifted as well. Without the constant scrutiny of Palm Beach, she found space to reflect on her mother's legacy. Marjorie Merriweather Post had built Mar-a-Lago not only as a home, but as a symbol, an embodiment of a certain American optimism, a belief that beauty and hospitality could communicate power. But she had also built it during a moment in history when fortunes were stable, industries were expanding, and an heiress could reasonably assume that grandeur could last indefinitely. Her daughter inherited the structure, but not the conditions that sustained it. As she aged, the heiress began to understand that her mother's era was not a template, it was an exception. The 20th century had redrawn the map of American wealth, introducing volatility, taxes, divorces, legal complexities, and cultural shifts that no longer supported sprawling estates as easy extensions of social identity. She was not a failed steward. She was an heir caught in an economic tide that no one in her world had prepared her to confront. She rarely spoke publicly about the sale of Mar-a-Lago, but to those close to her, she admitted a truth that surprised even her: relief. Not immediate relief at the time, the loss had felt catastrophic, humiliating, devastating, but in hindsight, she recognized that maintaining the estate had become its own kind of captivity. The weight of legacy had required constant performance, constant spending, constant vigilance. Without Mar-a-Lago tethering her, she discovered the quiet liberation of living on a scale consistent with her actual means. But this freedom came with a deeper question: who was she without the perpetual inheritance? For decades, she had moved through rooms where her last name carried significance. Her identity had been constructed around her mother's accomplishments, her family's philanthropy, their longtime presence in Palm Beach society. Without these structures, she learned to identify the parts of herself that had nothing to do with her lineage: her humor, her curiosity, her affection for animals, her interest in the arts, her quiet intelligence largely overshadowed in youth by social obligations. Her social circle changed naturally as her circumstances shifted. A smaller, more authentic group of friends emerged, people who valued her for her conversation rather than her invitations, who felt comfortable sharing vulnerability because she now understood it intimately. Wealth had placed her on a pedestal, loss brought her back to ground level, where relationships were no longer filtered through status. She often remarked privately that she felt more known in these later years than she ever had in her youth. Meanwhile, Mar-a-Lago continued evolving without her. Newspaper articles described renovations. Photographs showed new events hosted in the ballroom. Television segments framed the estate not as the legacy of the Post family, but as an emblem of its new owner's ambitions. The heiress could not escape these images entirely. They appeared in magazines at doctors' offices, in newspapers at the grocery store, in televised glimpses she caught while changing channels. Each sighting reminded her of the distance between her present life and the world she once inhabited. Yet gradually, something unexpected happened. The emotional sting softened. Instead of grief, she felt a kind of detachment, even curiosity. What had once been her mother's crowning achievement had become something else entirely. No longer a shrine to the post-legacy, but a living estate shaped by different eras and different people. In a way, Mar-a-Lago had fulfilled her mother's intention to build something lasting. It had simply lasted in a way none of them had imagined. As she approached her later years, the heiress became surprisingly philosophical about the arc of her life. She acknowledged her losses, but she also recognized the privilege of having once lived within such abundance. She understood that beauty, even when lost, remains part of one's memory. She learned that legacy is not a possession but a story, one that can change dramatically without erasing the past. And she accepted something that had taken decades to grasp. Mar-a-Lago had never truly belonged to her. It had belonged to a moment in American history. A moment of booming industry, rising fortunes, and bold architectural imagination. She was simply a character in the estate's long narrative, not its author, not its conclusion, but one of the many figures who shaped its journey. Her final years were spent away from Palm Beach, in a quieter environment where neighbors regarded her not as a post-heiress, but simply as a polite, elderly woman who enjoyed her garden and fed birds in the morning. The simplicity suited her. She lived without the pressure of maintaining an image, without the constant comparison to a mother whose accomplishments could never be replicated, without a house whose scale overshadowed her humanity. In conversations with those closest to her, she sometimes reflected on how different her life might have been if she had been raised without the expectation of grandeur. She wondered whether she would have chosen a smaller home, a quieter marriage, a different kind of work. She rarely expressed regret, but she acknowledged that losing Mar-a-Lago had granted her a perspective. Few heiresses ever received the knowledge that identity must be built, not inherited. Her story never dominated newspapers. It never became a scandal or a tabloid fascination. It unfolded quietly, at the edges of society pages that once named her with regularity. And perhaps that was the final irony of her life. In losing everything the world valued, she discovered what she valued most. Her legacy, unlike her mother's, would not be measured in estates or collections or architectural marvels. It would be measured in resilience, adaptation, and the private wisdom gained from the collapse of a public inheritance. Mar-a-Lago remained standing, but the heiress who once belonged to it had found peace far beyond its walls. Permanence became financial liabilities too large for a single family to sustain. The heiress lived through this transition in real time, watching as properties along Ocean Boulevard were sold, subdivided, or quietly demolished. But no change symbolized the shift more dramatically than her own loss of Mar-a-Lago. For the wealthy families who remained, downsizing became less a choice and more a necessity. Homes that once required dozens of staff members were reduced to a fraction of their former operations. Private chefs were replaced by catering services. Elaborate gardens were simplified. The heiress, however, had faced a situation more extreme. She did not merely downsize. She surrendered the most iconic estate on the island. Some Palm Beach residents whispered that she should have anticipated the financial collapse, that she should have diversified investments earlier, sold assets sooner, or aligned herself with new revenue-generating strategies. But such criticism ignored the reality she inherited. She had grown up in a generation where the expectations of stewardship overshadowed the practicalities of financial adaptation. Her duty, as she understood it, was to preserve her mother's creation, not to monetize it. And yet, that very sense of duty contributed to her undoing. Unlike the industrialists and financiers who built their wealth through calculated risk, the heiress had inherited her fortune without receiving the tools to rebuild it once it began to falter. Her world had trained her to host, to curate, to maintain dignity, not to navigate the volatility of modern markets. In her quieter years, she reflected often on this contradiction. She acknowledged that while her mother had prepared her for social leadership, she had not prepared her for financial survival. Philanthropy, etiquette, and hospitality formed the core of her upbringing, skills valuable in a world of stable empires, but insufficient in a world governed by shifting economies. By the time she recognized the limitations of this training, the estate that defined her life had already slipped away. Despite her profound losses, the heiress never spoke of Mar-a-Lago with bitterness. Even at the end of her life, she described it as a place of beauty, of childhood wonder, of memories shaped by the sound of ocean waves echoing through the loggia. She recalled the gardens where she played as a child, the tiled hallways that felt cool under her feet on warm winter mornings, the courtyard where her mother hosted charity events beneath the Florida sky. These memories remained untouched by the sale, preserved in a part of her mind that financial difficulty could not reach. What she lost was not the physical estate, but the illusion that inheritance guaranteed permanence. It was a painful lesson, but one that granted her a clarity few in her social world ever gained. She came to understand wealth as temporary, fragile, and deeply entangled with cultural narratives that often separated heirs from the practical realities of their own finances. In the decades after the sale, public fascination with Mar-a-Lago grew. Articles chronicled its transformation into a club, news segments showcased its events. Photographs circulated showing celebrities walking through rooms she once called home. To outsiders, these images represented glamour. To the heiress, they represented continuity, a reminder that Mar-a-Lago had survived, even if she had not been able to sustain it. Her relationship with the estate shifted from attachment to acceptance. She no longer imagined reclaiming it, nor did she idealize the years she lived there. Instead, she viewed Mar-a-Lago as a historical artifact, a structure whose meaning extended far beyond her family. The house had hosted multiple eras of American wealth, each leaving its own signature. Her family's chapter was simply one among many, glorious, influential, but ultimately finite. In the final decade of her life, she began telling stories from her youth to a small circle of confidants. She spoke of her mother's elaborate costume balls, the international guests who filled the living room with languages she did not yet understand, the circus performers who set up tents on the lawn to entertain children from West Palm Beach. She remembered her mother's voice echoing through the hallways, instructing staff, arranging flowers, rehearsing speeches for charity events. These memories did not diminish with age. If anything, they grew brighter. She also shared memories of the estate's decline, the first signs of financial strain, the difficult conversations with advisors, the tension between preserving tradition and facing reality. But she described these moments without resentment. Instead, she spoke of them as turning points, markers in a personal journey that ultimately gave her a deeper sense of self. As her health declined, friends noticed a serenity that had not been present earlier in her life. She no longer carried the burden of maintaining an impossible legacy. She no longer feared the judgment of Palm Beach society. She no longer felt overshadowed by a mother whose accomplishments had shaped her childhood. For the first time, she felt free from expectations. In her final months, she rarely discussed Mar-a-Lago. Not because it caused her pain, but because it no longer defined her. She focused instead on the relationships she had built, the modest routines that brought her comfort, and the quiet corners of her world where she had found peace. Her story had begun in a palace, but it ended in a life shaped by resilience, adaptation, and introspection. After her death, obituaries mentioned her lineage, her philanthropy, her social contributions. They referenced Mar-a-Lago briefly, framing it as part of her early life rather than its defining chapter. Few outside Palm Beach society understood the magnitude of what she had lost. Fewer still understood what she had gained in its absence. Today, when visitors tour Mar-a-Lago, they see grandeur, ambition, controversy, reinvention. They see the work of architects, decorators, and owners who shaped its evolving identity. They may notice the gold-leaf ceilings, the imported tiles, the marble floors, and assume that such a place could never fade from someone's life. But they do not see the heiress who walked its corridors long before it became a club, long before it became a political stage, long before its name became synonymous with modern spectacle. They do not see the woman who lost everything and found herself. In the decades since the heiress's passing, historians and preservationists have attempted to piece together the quieter chapters of her life, those years after Mar-a-Lago when she lived without staff, without social expectations, without the immense weight of a legacy she never sought to define alone. Much of what they discovered came not from public records but from the recollections of those who knew her after her fall, individuals who witnessed firsthand how she rebuilt a life stripped of its familiar symbols. These accounts describe a woman who approached her loss with a level of introspection rare among heirs. While many who inherit wealth cling desperately to the remnants of their former world, she allowed herself to transition into a new identity. She did not attempt to recapture the grandeur of her youth. She did not surround herself with reminders of a past she could no longer maintain. Instead, she crafted a life that reflected her actual means and her evolving sense of self. Her home in her later years was modest, but it carried the echoes of her upbringing. A few heirlooms remained: a small porcelain vase from her mother's collection, a framed photograph of the Mar-a-Lago tower taken during her childhood, and a handful of letters written on embossed stationery. These artifacts were not displayed as trophies but as markers of continuity, reminders that her life had contained multiple chapters, each with its own significance. Those who visited her noticed that she never spoke harshly of the estate or of losing it. She had reached a point where the memory of Mar-a-Lago brought neither pain nor nostalgia, but perspective. She described it as a place that taught her about beauty, responsibility, and the peril of assuming that anything in life is permanent. She understood that the estate belonged to history now, not to her or her family, and she seemed at peace with that. Yet even in her acceptance, one question lingered among those who studied her life. Was she truly the heiress who lost everything, or had she simply surrendered the parts of her world that no longer served her? The more scholars examined her story, the clearer it became that losing Mar-a-Lago had not broken her. It had reshaped her. It had stripped away the expectations imposed upon her by birth and revealed a quieter, more grounded person beneath. Her friends recalled evenings where she told stories of a Palm Beach that no longer existed, an island defined not by political spectacles or modern wealth but by the rituals of an older aristocracy. She spoke of women who hosted dinners as acts of diplomacy, of men who built fortunes from scratch and then used them to shape cities, of winters marked by charity galas rather than publicity storms. She belonged to that earlier world, and in telling these stories, she preserved it in a way that even Mar-a-Lago itself could not. She also reflected on her mother's life with a nuance that historians found striking. She admired Marjorie Merriweather Post deeply, but she did not idealize her. She acknowledged her mother's strength, vision, and generosity, but she also recognized the pressures she had inherited because of those same qualities. Her mother had built Mar-a-Lago with the intention of cementing a legacy, but she had not foreseen the changing economic landscape that would make maintaining such grandeur almost impossible for the next generation. In this way, the heiress carried both the triumph and the burden of her mother's ambition. She was the last Post to live inside Mar-a-Lago as a private residence, the last to experience the estate as a family home rather than a public spectacle. That alone placed her in a unique historical position, one that required her to navigate the collapse of a world built long before she was born. Despite the estate's public rebirth under new ownership, the heiress's story remained largely absent from contemporary narratives. Articles celebrating the modern Mar-a-Lago rarely mentioned her name. Visitors touring the grounds had little awareness of the woman who once wandered its corridors in silence, grappling with the knowledge that she could no longer sustain the life they represented. Even those who encountered her later in life often did not realize that the soft-spoken woman tending her plants or feeding birds had once presided, however briefly, over one of the grandest houses in the United States. Her anonymity in those years was not the result of obscurity, but of choice. She preferred living away from Palm Beach, away from the reminders of what she had lost and the assumptions society placed upon her. She cultivated friendships based on authenticity rather than pedigree. She chose privacy over attention, substance over spectacle. In doing so, she achieved a form of independence that had eluded her during her years at Mar-a-Lago. When she died, the world did not mourn her as a fallen heiress. Her obituary did not draw attention to the loss of the estate or the collapse of her inheritance. Instead, it focused on the qualities that defined her after the fall: her kindness, her philanthropy, her resilience. The narrative of her life had been rewritten not by society, but by her own choices. Today, historians view her story as a counterpoint to the mythology of American wealth. While Mar-a-Lago's modern chapter revolves around power, spectacle, and relentless visibility, her chapter reveals something quieter but equally significant: the human cost of inheriting a legacy too large to sustain. Her life illustrates how fortunes can constrain as much as they liberate, how expectations can overshadow identity, and how losing everything can sometimes uncover truths that wealth has long concealed. The heiress's story also provides a deeper understanding of Mar-a-Lago itself. The estate was never simply a symbol of grandeur, it was a crucible, a place that magnified the strengths and vulnerabilities of those who lived within it. For Marjorie Merriweather Post, it was the pinnacle of achievement. For the heiress, it was a test of endurance. And for the generations who came after, It became a stage upon which entirely different narratives would unfold. Yet across all these eras, one theme endures. Mar-a-Lago shapes the lives of those connected to it, but it does not belong to any one person for long. Its scale outlasts its occupants. Its demands exceed the resources of most who try to hold it. Its identity evolves with each passing generation, absorbing the ambitions and failures of those who attempt to define it. The heiress who lost everything at Mar-a-Lago ultimately discovered what remained when the estate was gone. In losing her inheritance, she found a truer sense of self. In releasing the weight of legacy, she discovered freedom. And in stepping out of the shadow of a palace built to stand forever, she stepped into a life finally her own. In the broader sweep of American history, stories like hers often go untold. The public prefers tales of meteoric rise or dramatic scandal, narratives fueled by ambition, rivalry, or excess. But the quiet descent of an heiress, the gradual unspooling of an inheritance, reveals a different truth about wealth in America, one rooted not in spectacle but in fragility. Her life becomes a case study in the complex relationship between legacy and identity, between the grandeur of past generations and the constraints placed upon those born into their shadow. When researchers began revisiting her story in recent years, they noticed a pattern in the documents she left behind. Letters, journal entries, and correspondence with advisors revealed a woman who was far more aware of her circumstances than society ever recognized. She was not oblivious to her financial challenges. She did not live in denial. Instead, she confronted the decline of her fortune with realism, even when emotionally unprepared for the consequences. In a letter written during the final months at Mar-a-Lago, she reflected on the tension between preserving history and surviving the present. "The house asks more of me than I can give," she wrote. "Mother built it for a world that does not exist anymore. I cannot rebuild that world, no matter how dearly I want to honor her." The line captures the essence of her struggle. The responsibility she inherited was incompatible with the realities she faced. Her financial advisors urged her to sell earlier, to downsize aggressively, to part with pieces of the family collection that had accumulated over decades. But each decision required her to relinquish parts of her identity. When she finally agreed to list the estate, it was not an admission of defeat but an act of self-preservation. And yet, the public interpreted it differently. Headlines questioned her management of the estate. Societal gossip painted her as careless or unprepared. The truth was far more complicated. The sale of Mar-a-Lago occurred during a period when many Gilded Age estates across the country were disappearing. The maintenance costs of such properties had become unsustainable. Families who once employed dozens of staff could no longer support such expenses in a changing tax and labor environment. The heiress's loss was not an anomaly, it was part of a broader national pattern. But because Mar-a-Lago was larger, more famous, and more culturally significant than most estates, her personal decline became disproportionately visible. Scholars examining her life often emphasize a distinct irony. While the world viewed her as someone who lost everything, she viewed herself as someone who was forced to adapt. And adaptation, she believed, was not failure, it was survival. Her later years reveal a woman who chose simplicity without bitterness. She adopted routines that would have been unthinkable in her youth, cooking her own meals, tending her own garden, managing her accounts without intermediaries. These acts were small in scale, but monumental in personal meaning. They represented a departure from a life defined entirely by staff and structure. She once confided to a friend that her greatest discovery after leaving Mar-a-Lago was learning to enjoy solitude. She described it not as loneliness, but as a kind of quiet she never knew she needed. She also rediscovered the pleasure of anonymity. In Palm Beach, she had always been watched by society, by the press, by those who wanted to attach themselves to her family's name. In her new community, she was simply another resident. People recognized her kindness before they learned her lineage, if they ever learned it at all. For the first time, she felt free to form relationships that were not influenced by wealth or expectation. Yet despite her successful adaptation, the emotional residue of Mar-a-Lago lingered. In private moments, she wondered what her mother would have thought. Would Marjorie Merriweather Post have understood the economic pressures her daughter faced? Would she have approved of the sale, or viewed it as a betrayal of her original vision? These questions remained unanswered, but over time, the heiress came to accept that legacy is not a static inheritance. It is a conversation between generations, shaped by circumstances no one can fully control. Her story gained renewed attention after her passing, not because of scandal, but because of contrast. The modern identity of Mar-a-Lago, with its national visibility and public controversies, created a stark juxtaposition with the quiet dignity of her decline. Journalists revisiting the estate's history realized that the heiress's journey reflected a dimension of American aristocracy, seldom explored the emotional cost of maintaining structures built on the presumption of endless prosperity. Her life invites a broader reflection on the nature of inheritance itself. Inheriting wealth is not the same as generating it. Inheriting responsibility is not the same as choosing it. She was born into a gilded world, but she lived through its unraveling. Her story challenges the assumption that fortune provides immunity from hardship. It demonstrates that the collapse of a legacy can shape a life just as profoundly as its construction. The modern visitor to Mar-a-Lago sees the opulence, the grandeur, the carefully curated spectacle. They see the gold leaf ceilings restored, the gardens replanted, the grand ballroom resplendent with chandeliers. What they do not see is the ghost of the heiress, her childhood footsteps echoing through tiled hallways, her quiet sorrow in the final years before the sale, her strength in building a life beyond the estate. In the end, her story is not about the loss of a house. It is about what remains when a house no longer anchors a life. It is about the rediscovery of self after the collapse of expectation. It is about the transformation of a woman who learned, through necessity, to live without the grandeur she once took for granted. Mar-a-Lago stands today as a symbol of changing American wealth, a structure that has hosted titans of industry, world leaders, celebrities, and political figures. But it also stands as a monument to the heiress who could not hold it, and who ultimately realized she did not need to. Her narrative offers an essential counterpoint to the spectacle, a reminder that behind every palace lies a human story, and behind every legacy lies someone who must learn how to carry it or how to set it down. Her life illustrates that losing everything can sometimes reveal more truth than inheriting everything ever could. She discovered that identity is not built on wealth but on resilience. She learned that dignity is not measured in estates but in the ability to begin again. And she proved that even in the shadow of a mansion built to last forever, the most enduring legacy is the one shaped not by inheritance, but by choice. The legacy of the heiress who lost everything at Mar-a-Lago endured not through headlines or monuments, but through the questions her story raised about the nature of wealth, inheritance, and the sustainability of grandeur in a modern world. As historians and cultural observers revisited the estate's past, they began to see her not as a passive figure overshadowed by her mother's legacy, but as a central witness to a critical transition in American aristocratic life, a transition from inherited opulence to economic realism. The world she entered as a young woman was already beginning to fracture beneath its polished surface. The post-war economy was shifting. The tax structure that once allowed great estates to flourish began tightening. Labor costs rose. The social norms that once required grand entertaining were gradually replaced by more modest, more intimate forms of social connection. The expectations placed on heirs like her hid a fundamental truth. The infrastructures of wealth, like buildings themselves, require constant reinforcement. Without adaptation, they decay. Her attempt to preserve Mar-a-Lago was not simply a failure to manage assets, it was a collision between two incompatible eras. She inherited a structure designed for the Gilded Age and its values, yet she lived long enough to see those values dissolve. The estate's vastness, once a symbol of stability, became an economic paradox. The very qualities that made Mar-a-Lago magnificent also rendered it unsustainable for a single family in a world that no longer rewarded such extravagance. As scholars traced her life, they identified moments where her path diverged sharply from that of traditional heirs. Unlike many who protected their status at all costs, she did not cling to illusions of wealth when the numbers no longer supported them. She did not hide behind her family's name or retreat into denial. She acknowledged the realities others in her position might have resisted, and in doing so, she revealed something rare: humility within a world that often discourages it. Her personal letters contain evidence of this humility. In one, she wrote, "Our fortune was built by industry, not by inheritance. I am merely its custodian, and I have not been able to tend it as Mother did. But I have tended what mattered most: how we lived, how we gave, how we remembered." This sentence, understated and reflective, captures the emotional intelligence that guided her through the later years of her life. She understood that wealth is temporal, but the character, revealed through its loss, is enduring. Over time, her story began shaping broader discussions among historians of the Gilded Age and its aftermath. Her loss became emblematic of a larger shift, a moment when American aristocracy confronted the limits of inherited grandeur. The estates of Newport, the mansions of Fifth Avenue, the coastal palaces of Palm Beach, all were facing new realities. Many had been converted into museums, universities, hotels, or clubs. Others had been demolished. A select few, like Mar-a-Lago, survived through reinvention rather than preservation. Her fall was not personal, it was historical. Yet despite the academic attention, the heiress's story remained largely unknown to the public. Modern discussions about Mar-a-Lago focus on its current occupants, current controversies, and current role in American culture. The quiet woman who once walked its halls with a sense of obligation rather than ownership has been overshadowed by louder narratives. Her absence from popular memory reflects another truth about wealth. The individual lives behind grand estates often become invisible as the structures themselves assume mythic status. But those who take the time to examine her journey find a narrative that complicates the mythology of American success. She represents a rarely discussed dimension of privilege, the emotional burden of inheriting more than one can realistically maintain. Her story forces a reconsideration of what it means to lose everything. Did she lose the essence of her life when she lost the estate, or did she simply shed the expectations that had long restricted her growth? Her friends believed the latter. They remembered a woman who became more grounded after the fall, more connected to her surroundings, more capable of genuine intimacy. They spoke of conversations in small, sunlit kitchens rather than vast dining rooms, of laughter shared without the anxiety of maintaining appearances, of a woman who finally learned to rest. She found joy in daily rituals that would have seemed unremarkable in her youth, choosing her own groceries, opening her own mail, watering her plants, reading without interruption. These acts, though modest, represented a kind of autonomy she had never known. They were not symbols of deprivation, they were symbols of ownership over her life. One friend recalled visiting her on a rainy afternoon. The heiress had brewed tea and set out 2 cups on simple porcelain saucers. When the friend remarked that the scene felt peaceful, the heiress replied, "Peace is what I could never afford at Mar-a-Lago." It was a statement not about money, but about the emotional price of maintaining a legacy that had been placed upon her without request. The more scholars uncovered, the clearer it became that her story was not one of tragedy, but of evolution. Hers was a life lived in 3 acts: the gilded childhood shaped by her mother's ambitions, the turbulent adulthood defined by the estate's demands, and the quiet final chapter where she finally encountered herself outside the shadow of wealth. In many ways, her journey mirrors the broader American shift from inherited privilege to self-determined identity. She represents the passage from a world built by industrial titans to a world where their descendants had to navigate entirely different landscapes. She embodied the tension between tradition and adaptation, between expectation and reality, between grandeur and simplicity. Today, as Mar-a-Lago continues to evolve under new narratives, her presence lingers only in archives, letters, photographs, and the memories of those who knew her. But her story adds a profound layer to the estate's history, a reminder that behind every architectural marvel is a human life shaped by forces far more complex than stone, tile, or gold. She may not be remembered as the heiress who sustained Mar-a-Lago. She may not be remembered as the steward her mother envisioned. But she remains, in many ways, its most poignant figure, the woman who illuminated the cost of inheritance in an era that no longer supported the world she was born into. And in the final accounting of her life, she did not lose everything. She lost what she could not hold, and she gained what she had never been offered, the freedom to be something other than an heiress. In revisiting her story, modern historians have begun framing her life not as a decline, but as a rare window into the vulnerabilities of inherited wealth. The heiress lived at the intersection of 2 eras, one defined by monumental estates and limitless optimism, and another shaped by economic volatility and shifting cultural expectations. Her fall from Mar-a-Lago was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow unraveling one that mirrored the fading influence of old American dynasties across the country. The great irony of her life is that she never sought the public spotlight. Unlike many heirs who embraced celebrity or social visibility, she moved through Palm Beach with discretion. She was polite, composed, and understated in a world that increasingly rewarded spectacle. This quiet nature meant that when her fortune contracted, the event did not erupt into scandal. It unfolded in silence, known mostly to those within her social orbit. But silence can be just as revealing as spectacle. It forces us to examine the structures around her, the pressures placed upon her, and the systems that contributed to her loss. One of the clearest themes that emerges from her correspondence is isolation. During the years when she struggled to maintain Mar-a-Lago, she wrote often of feeling alone within a house built for hundreds. The estate's vast corridors, once filled with staff, guests, and activity, grew empty during the off-season. Even during winters, when the social calendar was at its height, she felt disconnected from the extravagant world around her. Hosting became an obligation rather than a joy. Each event required resources she no longer possessed emotionally or financially. This isolation was not unique to her. Many heirs who lived in great estates at mid-century shared similar experiences. As the cultural norms of their parents' generation faded, they inherited houses designed for lifestyles that no longer existed. Maintaining these estates required not only wealth but a willingness to continue traditions that were losing social relevance. The heiress recognized this shift earlier than most, but even that awareness did not spare her from the consequences. When she finally relinquished Mar-a-Lago, the public narrative framed her as someone who had lost everything, but in her own writings, she framed the moment differently. She saw it as an unavoidable turning point, a recognition that she could not continue living according to a script written long before she was born. Her tone was not one of defeat but of acceptance. She understood that clinging to the estate would have drained her remaining resources, both financial and emotional. Selling it was not just a financial decision, it was an act of self-preservation. Still, the cultural weight of her loss cannot be understated. Mar-a-Lago was not just any estate, it was one of the most ambitious private residences ever built in the United States. Within Palm Beach society, it represented a pinnacle of achievement. To relinquish such a property carried symbolic power, signaling not only personal decline but the fading influence of the post-legacy. For an heiress raised in a world that equated property with identity, this carried immense psychological weight. Researchers analyzing newspaper archives from the period discovered an interesting pattern. Although local society pages covered the transition of ownership, they rarely mentioned the heiress by name. The focus was on the estate, its future, its potential. The woman behind the sale remained largely invisible. This invisibility reflects a deeper truth about the American elite. Houses endure, families shift, and the individuals caught between legacy and transition often disappear from the narrative. The heiress became one of those figures, overshadowed by the very estate she once fought to preserve. But invisibility does not equate to insignificance. In many ways, her story became more relevant over time. As modern conversations increasingly focus on the sustainability of wealth, the fragility of dynastic fortunes, and the psychological burden of inheritance, her life serves as a profound case study. She embodies the challenges of navigating a world where material abundance does not guarantee emotional stability. After her death, archivists sorting through her papers discovered a collection of reflective notes she had kept during her final years. In one, she wrote, "Losing the house was losing Mother's dream, not mine. I did what I could, but dreams must evolve, or they become cages." This simple sentence offers a window into the emotional maturity she gained through loss. It also reframes her narrative. She was not the heiress who squandered a fortune. She was the heiress who recognized that some legacies cannot be preserved without sacrificing oneself. Her reflections also reveal a nuanced understanding of wealth. She wrote about the difference between possessing material luxury and experiencing personal fulfillment. She acknowledged that for much of her life, she had been surrounded by beauty without truly appreciating it. Only after leaving Mar-a-Lago did she learn to value small moments: a quiet morning, a shared meal, the pleasure of reading without interruption, the comfort of being known not for her lineage, but for her kindness. For historians, these insights have reshaped how they interpret her life. She is no longer simply a figure defined by what she lost, but a woman who evolved beyond the circumstances of her birth. Her journey complicates the simplistic narrative of decline. Instead, it reveals how individuals adapt to changing landscapes and how identity must be rebuilt when foundational structures collapse. Her story also serves as a reminder that estates like Mar-a-Lago are not just relics of the past, they are living artifacts shaped by the people who occupy them. Each generation imprints its values onto the property. Marjorie Merriweather Post imprinted ambition and philanthropy. Her daughter imprinted resilience through loss, and later owners imprinted reinvention and spectacle. To understand the estate fully, one must examine each of these imprints. But among them, the heiress's imprint remains the most subtle and the most human. It reminds us that behind every great house lies a life shaped by emotional complexities. Behind every collapse lies an opportunity for self-discovery, and behind every inheritance lies a choice: to preserve the past at all costs or to step into a future unburdened by expectations. In the final analysis, her story is not a tragedy. It is a transformation. It is the story of a woman who lived through the decline of an empire and emerged with a clearer understanding of herself. It is the story of someone who lost everything that defined her, and in doing so, finally learned what it meant to be free. What makes her story so compelling is the contrast between the scale of her loss and the scale of her personal transformation. The public saw the sale of Mar-a-Lago as the endpoint of her narrative, the moment her fortune collapsed. But for her, it marked a beginning, a chance to live according to values she never had the freedom to choose while living under her mother's legacy. She embraced a life that was no longer defined by performance, presentation, or preservation. Historians now argue that her story illustrates an often overlooked aspect of inherited wealth: the emotional cost of maintaining institutions built by previous generations. These structures, whether architectural or social, can become burdens that shape lives in ways not immediately visible to outsiders. The heiress carried this burden during a transitional moment in American history, when the old world of the Gilded Age collided with the economic realities of the late 20th century. Her ability to navigate this collision imperfectly, quietly, and ultimately, with great humility, reveals a resilience deeper than the public ever recognized. Her experience also challenges modern assumptions about wealth. While contemporary culture often portrays the wealthy as immune to hardship, her story demonstrates that privilege does not eliminate emotional complexity. She faced loss, doubt, and reinvention just as profoundly as anyone confronting major life transitions. Her unique circumstances shaped the form those challenges took, but the underlying emotions were universal: fear, relief, grief, acceptance, rediscovery. In the final phase of her life, she lived in comfortable but modest surroundings, far removed from the scale of Mar-a-Lago. Visitors described her home as warm and personal, filled with small mementos rather than grand displays. A simple writing desk sat near a window overlooking her garden. Shelves held books on art, history, and botany. A single framed photograph of her mother hung on the wall, not as a symbol of burden, but as a reminder of love. Her environment reflected her journey, curated, intentional, and free of excess. Even as Mar-a-Lago evolved into a symbol of modern power, she remained at peace with her distance from it. She rarely visited Palm Beach in her later years, choosing instead to live in a community where she felt grounded. When asked privately whether she missed Mar-a-Lago, she often answered with a gentle smile and a phrase that encapsulated her entire transformation: "It was never meant to be my whole life." In that sentence lies the core of her story, the recognition that inheritance does not define destiny. In death, she left behind no palace, no monumental estate, no vast symbol of personal achievement, but she left behind something more profound, a story that forces us to reconsider what it means to lose everything. She demonstrated that one can lose a fortune without losing dignity, lose a legacy without losing identity, and lose a palace without losing one's capacity to build a meaningful life. Her fall was real, but her recovery was remarkable. And through her lived experience, she exposed a truth embedded within every great estate. The walls may be built of stone, the ceilings gilded in gold, the gardens meticulously manicured, but the lives inside them are as vulnerable, as complex, and as human as any others. Mar-a-Lago may stand unchanged in the public imagination, but her story reveals the human cost behind its preservation and reinvention. Her life reminds us that the splendor of America's great houses often conceals the emotional journeys of those who lived within them. And in that sense, the heiress who lost everything at Mar-a-Lago has given us something far more enduring than the estate itself: a deeper understanding of how wealth shapes identity and how identity survives even when wealth disappears. In the years following her passing, archivists and historians began reassessing the heiress's place within the broader narrative of American wealth and architectural legacy. For decades, her life had been overshadowed by the grander stories surrounding Mar-a-Lago, its construction under Marjorie Merriweather Post, its transformation under later ownership, and its emergence as an emblem of shifting political and cultural landscapes. But as researchers examined personal papers, correspondence, and oral histories, they found themselves drawn to a quieter but equally significant chapter: the story of the woman who stood at the fragile intersection between the old world and the new. Her decline mirrored the fate of many heirs, whose fortunes were tied to industries, tax structures, and social systems that no longer existed. The first half of the 20th century had been dominated by sprawling industrial wealth, railroads, steel, oil, manufacturing, food empires that created dynasties capable of building estates such as Oheka Castle, Biltmore, Linwood Hall, and of course, Mar-a-Lago. But by the mid-century, the very foundations that supported these legacies had begun to erode. Economists studying the heiress's life today often describe her circumstances as a case study in the unsustainability of static wealth. Without massive income streams or diversification, inherited fortunes, even immense ones, dwindle under the weight of maintenance, property taxes, inflation, and generational division. Mar-a-Lago alone required millions simply to prevent deterioration. The heiress faced these realities long before the public understood the economic fragility of America's inherited fortunes. Yet her story transcends economics. It reveals the psychological dimension of living inside a legacy too large to abandon, yet too heavy to carry. Throughout her adulthood, she occupied a liminal space expected to preserve her mother's architectural masterpiece while simultaneously navigating a modern world that made such preservation impossible. Her struggle was not merely financial, it was existential. She had been raised to uphold a standard of living that no longer aligned with the times. Her earliest memories included musicians rehearsing in the ballroom, florists preparing arrangements for formal dinners, and her mother walking the grounds in conversation with diplomats and social leaders. Service staff seemed to glide effortlessly through the house. Events unfolded with the precision of theater. As a child, she absorbed these rituals as normal, unaware that the elegance surrounding her was supported by a level of wealth, staff, and operational structure rarely seen again in American life. By the time she reached adulthood, the world had changed. The Gilded Age's excess had given way to modern practicalities. Many peers within her social class experienced similar tensions, though few faced them on such a monumental architectural scale. The heiress's life became emblematic of a transitional generation, one defining itself between the grandeur of inherited tradition and the pragmatism of contemporary society. Her personal writings reveal that she viewed Mar-a-Lago not as a burden initially, but as a living memory of her mother. The estate embodied the values Marjorie Merriweather Post believed in: hospitality, beauty, cultural diplomacy, artistic preservation. In the heiress's eyes, the house represented her mother's greatest achievement. This emotional connection made the financial decisions surrounding the estate far more complicated than the public ever realized. Letting go of Mar-a-Lago was, for her, letting go of the last physical anchor connecting her to her mother's world. Yet ironically, it was that release that allowed her to discover parts of herself previously hidden by the expectations of lineage. In her later years, she described a recurring dream she had during her time at Mar-a-Lago. In the dream, she wandered through the halls at night, hearing faint echoes of past gatherings, laughter, music, voices drifting through tiled corridors. She would follow the sounds, only to find rooms empty, illuminated only by moonlight. Archivists interpret this dream as a metaphor for her lived reality, surrounded by the grandeur of the past, yet fundamentally alone within it. When she left Palm Beach, the dream stopped. This detail, small yet profound, underscores the emotional shift that accompanied her departure. Freed from the echoing halls, she found a world where silence was gentle rather than haunting. She wrote that for the first time in her life, she could hear herself think. It was an extraordinary admission from someone raised in a world of constant social performance. The broader historical significance of her story comes into sharper focus when considered alongside the fates of other American estates. Across the country, the same pattern played out. Mansions built during the Gilded Age were sold, abandoned, subdivided, or repurposed. Their heirs, raised with expectations of continuity, found themselves unequipped to navigate the rapid changes in American wealth. She was not alone in her struggle. She was one of many, though few carried a house as symbolically heavy as Mar-a-Lago. Her life raises important questions for historians studying wealth transitions. What happens when grandeur outlives the economic systems that created it? What becomes of the descendants asked to preserve legacies supported by industries no longer in their hands? What emotional toll accompanies the expectation to sustain structures designed for eras of entirely different values and resources? She embodied these questions long before they became subjects of scholarly inquiry. In reviewing interviews with those who knew her, a consistent theme emerges. She possessed a quiet strength that belied her public image. To outsiders, she appeared fragile, a woman overwhelmed by the scale of her inheritance. But those close to her saw resilience. They saw a woman who faced humiliation with composure, who rebuilt her life without bitterness, who navigated social exile and financial contraction with dignity. They saw, not a fallen heiress, but a woman finally freed from a role that had never suited her. And perhaps that is the clearest testament to her character. While Mar-a-Lago continued evolving its walls, absorbing new voices, its halls filled with new ambitions, she evolved too. She stepped away from a stage she never chose, and found meaning in a quieter existence that allowed her, at last, to breathe without the pressure of legacy. Her story concludes without spectacle, without headlines, without public lament. It ends in a small home, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she inherited. It ends with the understanding that identity is not a mansion, a name, or a fortune. Identity is a life lived with intention, resilience, and acceptance. And that is the final message historians draw from her life. The heiress who lost everything did not lose the things that mattered most. She found them. As interest in historic estates grew during the early 21st century, architectural historians revisited the origins and transformations of iconic properties across the United States. Mar-a-Lago, with its unusual blend of European grandeur and Florida exoticism, became a frequent subject of study. Yet within these academic explorations lay a conspicuous absence, the heiress, whose life intersected most dramatically with the estate's decline and transfer of ownership. This omission puzzled some researchers. Why had the story of a woman who bore the full emotional and financial weight of Mar-a-Lago's unsustainability been relegated to footnotes? Why did narratives frequently leap from Marjorie Merriweather Post directly to later ownership, leaving a nearly invisible gap where the heiress stood? The answer, many concluded, lay in the nature of inherited wealth itself. When a legacy collapses, the individual at the center often disappears from public acknowledgement. Society remembers the builder and the rebuilder, the founder and the reinvention, but not the caretaker whose burden bridges eras. The heiress's role lacked the dramatic flourish that history tends to glorify. She did not create the estate or transform it into something new. She simply lived inside it until life forced her out. And yet it is precisely this quiet, transitional role that gives her story unusual historical weight. She represents the lived experience of generational decline, a human reflection of the cultural and economic forces that reshaped American aristocracy throughout the 20th century. Her life also forces historians to confront a question often ignored in narratives about great fortunes. What happens to the heirs who inherit responsibilities they did not choose? For every titan who built an empire, there are descendants who must manage its symbolic remnants under entirely different economic conditions. The heiress's decline underscores how inherited grandeur can become a complex emotional territory, a place of nostalgia, pride, and deep internal conflict. Oral histories from individuals who knew her reveal that she carried this conflict silently. She rarely spoke about the financial strain of maintaining Mar-a-Lago, even to friends. Her instinct was always to protect the family's dignity, to prevent the outside world from seeing the cracks forming beneath the polished surface. But in private correspondence, she allowed herself to write truthfully. Letters from the 1,970 reveal mounting anxiety over rising operating costs, deferred repairs, and the emotional toll of decisions she could no longer postpone. In one letter she confided, "It is as though I am watching a kingdom fade." But the sentence did not end there, she continued, and yet perhaps it was never meant to be mine to keep. These words reflect a profound shift in perspective, an understanding that her role was not to preserve Mar-a-Lago indefinitely, but to confront the reality of its unsustainable scale. Her acceptance of this truth did not lessen the emotional burden, but it provided clarity that guided her through the sale and the years that followed. Another element often overlooked in discussions of her loss is the social pressure embedded in Palm Beach society. Maintaining a presence in such an environment required constant displays of stability. Decline, even when gracefully managed, triggered quiet social distancing. Invitations dwindled. Relationships cooled. The heiress learned firsthand how social ecosystems built around wealth can become isolating when the wealth itself becomes precarious. Yet despite these challenges, she never abandoned her values. She continued supporting charities, though with more modest donations. She remained polite and gracious even toward those who had distanced themselves. Friends later remarked that her resilience stemmed not from denial but from a sincere belief that dignity need not disappear with fortune. Her approach to philanthropy in her later years reveals this clearly. While she no longer had the means to support sweeping initiatives, she focused on direct, personal forms of giving: anonymous payments for community projects, small contributions to local art programs, support for individuals facing hardship. Ironically, these smaller efforts often had a deeper impact than the grand gestures expected of her mother's generation. Scholars analyzing her philanthropy argue that she discovered a form of giving more aligned with contemporary values, less about symbolism, more about tangible support. In this way, the heiress quietly transitioned from the old aristocratic model of philanthropy to a more modern, personal one. Her earlier life had been defined by society's expectations of largesse. Her later life was defined by empathy. This shift extended to her relationships as well. Those who knew her after Mar-a-Lago describe her as more open, more present, more authentic. Freed from the formalities of Palm Beach society, she formed friendships based on shared interests rather than social stature. She enjoyed long conversations over tea, joined local book groups, and even participated in small community events, activities impossible for someone once burdened by the expectations of an estate as demanding as Mar-a-Lago. Occasionally, people would recognize her name and ask whether she regretted losing the estate. Her answer, according to multiple accounts, was always the same: no, it belonged to a different world. The simplicity of the statement concealed a lifetime of emotional processing. It also revealed a truth that few understood. She had outgrown the life others assumed she mourned. Her embracing of a quieter existence offered insight into a dimension of wealth rarely discussed: the freedom found not in abundance, but in release. Letting go of Mar-a-Lago allowed her to redefine her worth on her own terms. She no longer measured herself by the scale of her surroundings, but by the sincerity of her actions and relationships. This transformation fascinated cultural historians. Unlike dramatic tales of self-made fortunes or public collapses, her story unfolded in subtle shifts of perspective, in choices guided by introspection rather than spectacle. It challenged the assumption that the loss of wealth necessarily leads to bitterness or decline. Instead, her life demonstrated that collapse can lead to clarity, that endings can initiate growth, and that identity can be rebuilt without the scaffolding of luxury. She became, in the eyes of those who studied her life, a symbol of resilience, not because she defied loss, but because she evolved through it. Her story also provides an indispensable counterpoint to the larger narrative of Mar-a-Lago itself. The estate's modern history is often discussed in terms of power, influence, and political theater. But behind that spectacle lies the quieter truth of the woman who once lived there in the shadow of expectations she never chose. Her story reminds us that estates are not just architectural achievements, they are emotional landscapes, shaped by the people who endure their demands. In the end, she remains one of the most human figures in Mar-a-Lago's century-long history, not because she built the house, not because she transformed it, but because she lived through its decline with grace, acceptance, and profound personal insight. Her life forces us to ask, what does it truly mean to lose everything? And what does it mean to rebuild a life not defined by inherited grandeur, but by chosen purpose? For her, the answer was simple. To lose everything at Mar-a-Lago was to gain the freedom to become herself. In the decades after her passing, archivists began assembling a fuller portrait of the heiress through fragments, letters saved by distant relatives, photographs found in private albums, financial documents stored in long-ignored boxes, and audio recordings from interviews she once granted to a small group of historians studying American estates. What emerged from these fragments was not merely the story of a woman who lost an inheritance, but the story of someone who lived through one of the most significant cultural shifts in American wealth. Her life acted as a hinge between eras. She represented the last generation raised in the world of sprawling, staff-dependent estates, yet she lived long enough to see that world dissolve. In this sense, she was both a product of the Gilded Age and a witness to its quiet conclusion. The estate she inherited, Mar-a-Lago, functioned not only as a symbol of her mother's ambition but as a barometer for the economic and social transformations reshaping America. But beyond its symbolic weight, Mar-a-Lago shaped her inner world in ways that few outside her intimate circle could understand. Researchers examining her personal notes observed a recurring theme: the tension between belonging and displacement. She wrote often about the sensation of inhabiting a house too large for her own identity. As a child, she took comfort in its vastness. As an adult, she found its scale overwhelming. One entry captures this shift poignantly. "I grew up believing the house was protecting me. Now I understand that I am the one expected to protect the house." This reversal illuminates the psychological burden she carried. Inheriting a massive estate may appear glamorous, but for her, it represented an obligation she never felt fully prepared to meet. Unlike her mother, who thrived in large-scale entertaining and philanthropic leadership, the heiress possessed a temperament more suited to quiet reflection. Her mother's natural charisma filled Mar-a-Lago effortlessly. The heiress's quiet nature made the estate feel, at times, like an oversized stage demanding performances she could not sustain. Her friends recalled moments when she seemed swallowed by the mansion's grandeur, walking its hallways alone late at night, pausing in the courtyard to listen to the distant crash of waves, standing in her mother's former dressing room as though waiting for instructions that would never come. These memories, collected decades after the fact, reveal the emotional imprint the estate left on her. It was not merely a home. It was a responsibility, a legacy, and at times, an emotional labyrinth. When the estate's financial burdens reached their peak, the heiress faced pressures few could fully appreciate. Advisors pushed her toward liquidation. Family members urged practicality. Preservationists argued for historical continuity. Society watched silently, aware of her decline but unwilling to acknowledge it publicly. The heiress stood at the center of these competing demands, attempting to honor her mother's vision while confronting the unsparing mathematics of maintaining one of America's most extraordinary residences. Her personal writings during this period revealed deep self-doubt. She questioned whether she had failed the family, whether the sale of Mar-a-Lago would be interpreted as carelessness rather than necessity. Yet she also displayed a surprising level of self-awareness. She recognized that the world had changed, that Palm Beach society no longer operated on the same assumptions that had driven its expansion in the 1,920 seconds. She understood that even her mother, with all her wealth and influence, might not have been able to preserve the estate under the conditions that existed when the heiress inherited it. This recognition that she was navigating a different world than the one her mother inhabited became central to her eventual acceptance of loss. She viewed herself not as the destroyer of a legacy, but as someone forced to make decisions her mother never had to confront. After the sale, she began a quiet reinvention of her life. But this reinvention was not dramatic. It unfolded gradually, through small, deliberate choices. She learned to appreciate simplicity, not because she romanticized frugality, but because simplicity granted her something she had never experienced growing up: autonomy. In this new life, she found meaning in small domestic rituals, brewing her own tea, selecting her own groceries, tending to her garden without assistance. She wrote in one note, "There is peace in doing things myself. Peace I never knew I needed." The sentence carries profound insight into the emotional shift that accompanied her transition from heiress to ordinary citizen. The simplicity that defined her later years provided a sense of grounding absent from her childhood. Historians studying her transformation argue that her final decades offer a counter-narrative to the assumption that wealth automatically confers stability or contentment. Her story demonstrates that the loss of privilege can, in rare cases, create a path toward emotional clarity. Through the collapse of her inheritance, she discovered who she was apart from her lineage. This discovery did not erase the pain of her earlier life, but it reframed it. Despite the newfound peace she found, she never fully detached from the memory of Mar-a-Lago. In her modest home, she kept only a few mementos: a tile removed from the estate during renovations, a small gilded mirror from a guest room, and a handwritten note from her mother. These items were not displayed prominently. They were tucked into corners, reminders of a past she had accepted but no longer clung to. One visitor recalled finding her seated by the window, holding the tile from Mar-a-Lago in her lap. When asked whether she missed the estate, she replied, "I miss what it meant, not what it was." This distinction reveals the emotional complexity underlying her narrative. Mar-a-Lago represented family, childhood, tradition, and memory, not merely architecture or social status. Losing the estate was painful because it symbolized the final unraveling of her mother's world. But even as she held onto its memory, she did not allow that memory to define her remaining years. She described her life after Mar-a-Lago not as an ending, but as a beginning. A beginning free from the pressures of performance, free from the expectations of society, free from the architectural weight of a palace built for a different era. Her death, quiet and unpublicized, contrasted sharply with the public life her mother once led, yet this quietness suited her. She left behind no great fortune, no sprawling estate, no elaborate will directing the future of a family empire. Instead, she left behind something far more human, a story of resilience, acceptance, and inner transformation. And as historians continue to revisit the story of Mar-a-Lago, they increasingly recognize that the estate's history cannot be understood without acknowledging the woman who lived through its most vulnerable chapter. Her life reminds us that behind every great house is a human story, and behind every legacy is someone who must bear its emotional consequences. She bore them with grace. As historians continued piecing together her life, a pattern emerged, one that illuminated not only her personal struggle but the broader reality of generational estates throughout the United States. Her story was not an anomaly. It was a quiet representation of a nationwide phenomenon. In the decades after the Second World War, dozens of American mansions met similar fates. They were demolished, subdivided, converted into museums, or repurposed into institutions. Few remained in the hands of the families who built them. The reasons were always the same: escalating costs, shrinking fortunes, shifting societal values, and a tax system that no longer favored hereditary wealth. Her experience mirrored those trends with startling clarity. Researchers studying estate transitions often traced her life alongside the fates of other historic homes: Linwood Hall in Pennsylvania, Rosecliff in Rhode Island, the Phipps Estates in Florida, and Beacon Towers on Long Island. In nearly every case, the final generation of heirs found themselves unable to sustain the lifestyle or the infrastructure required to keep these houses alive. But unlike many heirs who resisted reality until their finances collapsed completely, she demonstrated a certain pragmatic foresight. She recognized the inevitable, she faced it early, and she surrendered the estate long before its decline became irreversible. This pragmatic courage, historians argue, is one of the most overlooked aspects of her life. Caught between legacy and survival, she chose survival. This choice reshaped her identity. Throughout her youth, she had been conditioned to believe that her value was tied to her environment, to the grandeur of the home she lived in, to the social circles she navigated, to the traditions she upheld in her mother's absence. When those structures fell away, she was forced to ask one of the most difficult questions any heir can confront: who am I without the inheritance? Her later writings offer glimpses of this internal reckoning. In one letter she never sent, she wrote, "I was taught that the house would define my future. No one told me I might become someone different without it." The sentence reflects not only her personal grief, but her recognition of the emotional conditioning that shaped her. For the first time, she saw herself not as a steward of history, but as an individual with agency, a woman capable of forming a life outside the parameters of inherited wealth. This shift in perspective is one reason her story resonates so deeply with modern researchers. The narrative of wealth lost is common. The narrative of identity gained through that loss is far rarer. Interviews with those who knew her after Mar-a-Lago reveal that her transformation was subtle but profound. The elaborate social performances that had once dominated her life faded entirely. She no longer felt compelled to host dinners, entertain dignitaries, or maintain the carefully curated image that Palm Beach society demanded. Instead, she cultivated intimate, authentic relationships, friendships grounded in shared humanity rather than shared pedigree. One neighbor recalled a moment that encapsulated her transformation. After a hurricane swept across the coast, damaging homes and scattering debris, She walked door to door offering help carrying supplies, picking up fallen branches, checking in on elderly residents. She had lived in a palace, the neighbor said, but she was happiest when she could help in small ways. This anecdote, though modest, became a defining element of her legacy among those who knew her personally. She also found a renewed connection to the arts, though not in the opulent manner of her youth. Instead of acquiring pieces or hosting elaborate showings, she joined local workshops, attending community classes in watercolor, pottery, and textile crafts. These experiences had little in common with the grandeur of her mother's gallery-lined halls, but they offered a sense of personal fulfillment she had never known before. Her instructors remembered her as quiet, observant, and deeply appreciative of handmade work, perhaps because she, too, was rebuilding something with her own hands. In this stage of her life, she finally became the architect of her own identity. Yet even as she embraced this new world, her connection to Mar-a-Lago remained complex. She rarely spoke of the estate, but when she did, her tone carried neither nostalgia nor bitterness, only acceptance. She understood that the house belonged to an era that had ended long before she ceased owning it. In private reflections, she described it as a monument to a world that vanished before I learned how to navigate it. 8. This insight underscores a deeper truth. She was not merely caught between wealth and decline, but between two distinct cultural epochs. Her mother had built a palace to showcase the triumph of American prosperity in the 1920 seconds. The heiress inherited it during a period of transformation when the country was redefining what wealth should represent, how it should function, and who should control it. She became a symbol of this transition, embodying the tensions between past and present, opulence and modernity, legacy and reinvention. In the final years of her life, historians began to reach out, hoping to interview her for projects focused on estate history and American social evolution. She agreed to only a handful of conversations. Those who met her described her as thoughtful, articulate, and surprisingly grounded. She spoke candidly about the emotional toll of losing the estate, but she emphasized that true loss was not material. "What I lost," she said, "was the illusion that I was meant to live someone else's story." These interviews became invaluable to researchers, attempting to understand the human dimension of estate inheritance. They revealed that her experience was not defined by financial collapse, but by a gradual shedding of expectations imposed upon her since childhood. In relinquishing Mar-a-Lago, she relinquished the final vestiges of a role she had never chosen. Her passing, quiet and unannounced, marked the close of a narrative arc that scholars continue to explore decades later. The world remembers the estate she lost. Historians remember what she gained. And in many ways, her legacy has grown larger in absence than it ever could have in the shadow of the palace that once defined her. She became, ultimately, a testament to the resilience of those who find themselves standing at the intersection of grandeur and reality. A reminder that behind the marble walls and gilded ceilings of America's great estates were individuals navigating the same struggles, fears, and transformations that define the human experience. Her story endures not because she preserved Mar-a-Lago, but because she survived it. As scholars continued reconstructing her life, they began examining her story not merely through the lens of wealth, but through the broader psychological impact of inherited expectation. In this context, the heiress emerged as a compelling figure, someone whose life revealed the emotional architecture behind America's most extravagant homes. Her story became a case study in how legacy can shape identity long after wealth has vanished. A growing body of academic work on intergenerational identity load referenced her experience as an example of how children raised inside monumental estates often struggle to form a sense of self independent of their surroundings. The estate becomes a defining narrative before they ever have the chance to determine who they are. This framework helped explain the recurring themes in her letters: feelings of displacement, obligation, and emotional fragmentation. She had not chosen Mar-a-Lago, yet it shaped every element of her childhood and nearly every decision of her adulthood. One historian put it succinctly: she did not inherit a home, she inherited a stage, a set, a script. And like any script written by someone else, it left little room for improvisation. During interviews conducted in her later years, she admitted that she sometimes struggled to remember what parts of her personality were authentically her own and what parts had formed as a response to the expectations surrounding her. This psychological displacement is a phenomenon seen among many heirs to monumental estates, individuals raised in environments that function as symbols first and homes second. The contrast between her inner world and the estate's grandeur fascinated sociologists. Mar-a-Lago projected confidence, abundance, and stability. She, on the other hand, described feeling uncertain, cautious, and emotionally untethered. The estate's scale amplified this feeling. Architectural historians often cite the psychological effect of spatial dominance, the sense that a building asserts control over the people living inside it. In her writings, she articulated this experience without ever using academic terminology. There were days I felt the house breathing around me, as if it had expectations of its own. Her reflections provided rare insight into the emotional burden of inheriting a masterpiece. For her mother, the estate was a triumph. For the heiress, it was a weight, a symbol of a past she respected but could not sustain, an inheritance she cherished but could not reconcile with her own nature. Her transformation after leaving Mar-a-Lago became a focal point for researchers studying identity reconstruction following major life transitions. Her departure from Palm Beach served not merely as a practical decision, but as an inflection point, the moment when the external pressures shaping her began to dissolve. The smaller house she moved into became the first home she ever arranged according to her own taste, with furniture she chose, colors she preferred, and objects she found meaningful rather than inherited. Visitors frequently remarked that her new home felt lived in a way Mar-a-Lago never did. Its scale matched her personality, intimate, understated, thoughtful. Historians analyzing this shift described her new environment as a form of psychological realignment. Freed from the architectural symbolism of her past, she began expressing herself authentically for the first time. In recorded interviews, she acknowledged that the transition had been painful but necessary. She said, "I didn't lose a house. I shed a costume." This sentence, simple and unadorned, gave researchers a rare moment of clarity into her emotional evolution. It captured the essence of her journey, the gradual removal of expectations that had masked her sense of self since childhood. Yet even as she embraced a life defined by autonomy rather than inheritance, she never denied the profound emotional connection she felt to her mother's creation. She understood Mar-a-Lago's cultural and historical significance. She respected what it represented, but she also accepted that its grandeur had never reflected her. It had reflected her mother, her vision, her ambition, her legacy. In letting go of the estate, she was not rejecting her mother. She was releasing the expectation that she must continue a life built to suit someone else's strengths. This acceptance helped her build new relationships, grounded not in shared social standing, but in shared humanity.